It was exactly 2:17 a.m. when Sister Evelyn answered the phone and never spoke again. The rain was coming down in long, slanted ribbons over the slate roof of St. Helena's Convent. An old rotary phone rang just once, then again, its bell echoing like a scream across the quiet stone halls. In the modest sleeping quarters just above the chapel, Sister Evelyn Morgan stirred from a light sleep. The kind of sleep people have when they're waiting for something without knowing it. She stood in her bare feet, habit still covering her shoulders, and walked slowly down the corridor. Her rosary beads clicked softly against her thigh with every step. There was no electricity. The storm had knocked it out hours earlier. But Evelyn knew the phone would still work. It always did. And it was ringing. And she was already too late. No one knew who was calling. The number wasn't logged. The line technically was disconnected. The convent hadn't paid for telephone service in years. The sisters had switched to letters and prayer and the occasional visitor from town. But the phone rang that night, and Sister Evelyn answered. A faint, static breath was the only sound on the other end. Then came a whisper, so soft it was barely audible over the crackling rain. Her hand began to tremble. A single tear slipped down her cheek as her lips parted, but failed to form words. It was as if she had heard something ancient, something meant only for her. Then silence, then darkness, then nothing. The next morning her bed was still made, her shoes untouched. Her Bible left open to a page that simply read, "And the voice I heard spoke to me once more, saying, 'Go, take the scroll.'" Revelation 10:8. No one saw her leave. No doors were opened, no windows broken. The storm had stopped just before dawn. When the other sisters searched for her, all they found was the phone off the hook swinging gently at the end of its cord. And one more thing. Taped to the wall behind the phone, as if placed with sacred precision, was a torn photo. A black and white portrait of a nun with no face, scratched out violently as if someone had used a needle. Above it, written in red ink, "Don't call back." For 11 years, no one did. St. Helena's closed 2 winters later. What few nuns remained were relocated. The phone was boxed and stored. The story whispered in town like a ghost, no, one wanted to summon. Until someone who should have known better did exactly that. An operator in Burlington, cleaning out decades of abandoned switches, found the number scribbled on an old request card. It shouldn't have worked, but she was curious, bored. It was late, and she dialed it. She only meant to check the line, but the moment she pressed send, the air shifted. In a distant room where walls still remembered her name, the phone rang again. It was exactly 2:17 a.m. Some people are haunted by what they've seen, others by what they never got to see. Clara Donnelly was 14 the last time she saw her Aunt Evelyn. It was Thanksgiving weekend, 2012. A quiet meal in a quiet house. Her aunt, dressed simply and always with that faint smell of lavender and candle smoke, had pressed a rosary into her hand as they hugged goodbye at the gate. "Prayer isn't always for answers," Evelyn had whispered. "Sometimes it's just to remind the silence that you're still listening." Clara never forgot that line, not because she understood it then, but because it felt too heavy to forget. When Evelyn disappeared, Clara's mother went silent, not with grief, but with shame. The kind of shame that doesn't come from loss, but from secrets buried too deep to name. Evelyn's name was no longer spoken in the house. Her photos were taken down, her letters thrown away before they were read. When Clara once dared to ask, "Do you think she's alive?" her mother had snapped like someone burnt from the inside. Dead or not, she made her choice. That was the last conversation they had about Evelyn Morgan. Years passed. Clara grew up, left Ash Hollow and moved to Boston, where silence didn't echo. It vanished in the noise. She buried herself in voices, became a freelance audio restoration specialist, worked on old cassette interviews, court depositions, church sermons and phone logs no one else wanted to touch. She loved it. Loved the quiet hunt in noisy places, loved how fragments revealed the shape of something real. But deep down, in the places not even work could reach, something was fraying. She couldn't explain it. At night, she'd hear faint ringing that never stopped. Not in her ears, in her bones. as if something old was waiting for her to pick up. Her dreams became soaked in candlelight and thunder, a door she couldn't open, a voice calling her name. The memories of Evelyn returned slowly. First in dreams, then in a dream she mistook for memory. A vision of Evelyn walking backward into a forest of bare crosses, her mouth sewn shut. Clara tried to forget it, but something refused to let go. One evening, while reorganizing her audio archive, Clara found an unlabeled cassette inside a padded envelope with no sender. The handwriting on the paper note was painfully familiar. "Clara, if this reaches you, do not ignore it. The number is still open, but it won't be for long. Call at 2:17 a.m. Her hands trembled as she stared at the envelope. 11 years, no word, no trace. But she knew this was her aunt's handwriting. She loaded the cassette. What she heard wasn't music, not even a voice. It was static, but not empty. The sound had shape, a strange, almost rhythmic layering like breathing behind glass. At the 30-second mark, there was a faint chime, then a whisper. He never left. The vow was broken. Listen to the silence, it remembers. Then the tape ended. Clara sat frozen, goosebumps on her arms, a ringing in her head that felt like recognition. She listened again and again, every time that voice pierced deeper, not with fear but with a kind of unspoken grief, the kind that lives in walls, the kind that waits, the kind that wants to be found. That night, she couldn't sleep. She took out the rosary Evelyn had given her all those years ago, ran her fingers over the beads, wondered if prayers could survive across time, wondered if guilt could echo through phone lines. And then she asked herself the question that changed everything. What if she never left? What if Evelyn wasn't missing but trapped in a loop of silence no one dared to enter? The next morning, Clara made a decision she hadn't allowed herself to consider in over a decade. She returned to Ash Hollow. The town had changed, but not enough. The gas station still had that blinking sign. The post office still closed on Mondays, and the old convent of St. Helena's still sat at the edge of town, its gates chained, its windows boarded, its walls stained by moss and memory. No one went there anymore. They said it felt wrong, that things moved when you didn't look. That sounds came from places that had no open space to echo. Clara didn't care. She needed to see it, to hear it. She parked across the street and stared at the stone structure. Her breath caught in her throat as memories returned. Evelyn laughing in the garden, Evelyn lighting candles in the dusk, Evelyn whispering to the shadows. There was a presence in that building. Not evil, no, something different. Something broken, watching. As the sun dipped below the hills, Clara stepped out of the car and pressed her palm to the iron gate. The metal was warm, not from the sun, from something else. She stood there for a long time, listening, not to the wind, not to the trees, to the silence, because something was inside it, calling her name. And this time, she was listening. If this feeling is familiar to you, comment "I felt it too." The following morning, Clara returned to St. Helena's with a crowbar, a flashlight and a notebook filled with questions she was afraid to answer. The lock on the back gate had rusted through, iron peeled, like dried bark. She didn't have to force it. Something had already given way long ago. As she stepped onto the gravel path, the air changed. It wasn't just colder, it was denser, like something had been holding its breath for years, and now it was watching her exhale. The chapel loomed ahead, its stained glass windows long shattered and patched with plywood. Moss curled like veins over the stone steps. A wooden sign above the main doors still read "Ora et Labora" in faded gold leaf, though the letters now looked more like a warning than an invitation. Clara walked around the building until she found what she was looking for, a small side, darker with a missing handle. She'd remembered it from childhood visits, the one Evelyn used when she didn't want the other nuns to notice she was leaving. Inside, it smelled of old pages, wet stone, and wax that had long since forgotten the warmth of flame. Dust choked the air like grief. Her flashlight beam cut through the gloom, shelves lined with broken hymnals, a toppled crucifix, a half-burned candle stuck to the floor. Everything had the look of abandonment, but not disorder. It was as if the building hadn't been left, but sealed. And the silence, it wasn't empty. It was crowded with things unsaid. She moved through the hallway, her boots leaving shallow impressions in the dust. The choir room, the kitchen, the dormitories, all untouched, until she reached Evelyn's. Still Waters. The door had been nailed shut from the outside, but the wood had warped with time. It gave way after 2 solid hits with the crowbar. Inside was a perfect stillness. No decay, no rot. Just stillness, as though time had never entered here. The bed was made. A blue robe still hung on the door. Her aunt's Bible sat open on the desk, a dried petal pressed between the pages. Clara picked it up. The passage was familiar. Be still and know that I am God, Psalm 46:10. But something else caught her eye, a notebook bound in cracked leather, tucked under the mattress. She opened it slowly. The first page was a list of phone numbers, none with names, just handwritten digits and the word received beside some, and did not answer beside others. One was circled, 802-55-1137. Underneath, Evelyn had written in tiny, shaking letters, "Only call after 2:17, never twice." Clara copied the number into her own notebook. She recognized the area code. Local, but not one she'd ever seen used. She circled it, her fingers cold despite the gloves. She turned the page. The next entry was dated September 3rd, 2012, just 2 months before Evelyn vanished. There is a rhythm in the silence now. It isn't just absence. It wants something. I wake each night at 2:17 to the sound of breathing through the walls. It's not mine, it doesn't belong here. I fear I've begun to understand what Sister Agnes meant before she was taken. It doesn't want prayer, it wants obedience. Clara paused. Sister Agnes? Taken. She flipped further. Dozens of entries, all growing more frantic. Mentions of a vow being broken, of a sound only certain people could hear, of a phone call that didn't come from anywhere, but passed through something. One entry simply read, "The line is not dead, it's waiting." She shut the notebook, heart pounding. On the shelf above Evelyn's desk was a shoebox. Inside, photos, black and white, mostly of the convent, the chapel, the sisters in line for Mass. Evelyn smiling faintly in the garden. Another nun with striking features, tall, severe, her eyes half-lidded like someone always listening to something just out of reach. On the back, written in red ink, Sister Agnes, 1979, gone, October 11th, 1981. Clara turned the photo toward the light and noticed something strange. In the background of the image, reflected in the window of the chapel door, was a figure, blurred, tall, wearing what looked like a long robe. But the face wasn't there, just a dark, hollow space. She felt a chill crawl up her arms. Not fear, recognition, that shape, that space. She had dreamed it, she flipped through the rest. One photo, however, had no image, just a white frame and Evelyn's handwriting on the back. The ones who hear the call are marked, not by sound, by silence. Just then, a low click echoed down the hallway. Clara froze, listened. It wasn't the wind, not an animal. It was deliberate. She stepped out into the corridor, shone her flashlight left, nothing. Right. A door she hadn't opened was ajar. The phone room. She knew it before she even stepped inside. A single rotary phone sat on a desk in the center of the room. The cord was curled neatly beside it. The line cut. The receiver dusty. She lifted it, cold to the touch. Nothing. And then, softly, impossibly, from the earpiece, "Clara." She dropped it. The voice hadn't come from the speaker. It had come from inside her head. Clara stumbled back into the hallway, breath shallow, notebook clutched to her chest. The silence was no longer still. It was pressing, watching, calling. And she was starting to remember. Clara didn't sleep that night. She sat in her car outside the convent, the same cassette Evelyn had mailed playing softly through her headphones. Loop after loop of static and whisper. But now she wasn't just listening, she was hearing something beneath it. Something rhythmic, like breath or footsteps. At 2:17 a.m. exactly, she rewound the tape again. And this time, the voice whispered something new. She opened the door they buried. Now it must stay open. She ripped off the headphones and looked at the convent. For a second, she swore the lights in the old chapel flickered, even though there was no electricity. Just a soft glow behind the boarded stained glass. She left, drove straight into town. The sky was just starting to bleed light over ash, hollow as she reached the public library. It didn't open for 2 more hours, so she parked outside and stared at her notebook, reading and rereading Evelyn's last words. Only call after 2:17, never twice. Clara circled the words, sister. Agnes. The name had never come up in family talk, never mentioned in town. But the image, the woman in that photo, tall and grave, like a figure meant to be obeyed, stayed lodged in her thoughts like a splinter. At 8 a.m., the library doors unlocked. She walked straight to the reference desk. Hi, I'm looking for any records related to St. Helena's Convent from the 1970s or 80s. Staff files, public incidents, obituaries, anything. The woman behind the desk, a pale and tired volunteer in her 60s, paused. You got a name? Clara hesitated. Sister Agnes. The woman's face stiffened. What's your connection? She was my aunt's colleague. My aunt disappeared. The woman looked over her shoulder as if someone were listening. Follow me. They walked into the back room where the old archives were stored. Newspaper clippings, microfilm, reels, municipal records yellowing in brittle folders. I shouldn't even let you back here, the woman said. But that convent, it changed after 1980. You're not the first person who's come asking. What happened in 1980? Silence. That's what happened. She left Clara alone with the archives. An hour in, Clara found the first article. October 13th, 1981. Local nun missing after lightning strike cuts power to St. Helena's. The article was short. Sister Agnes Dubray, age 42, hadn't been seen since a thunderstorm 2 nights prior. The last known sighting was during evening. Prayer before a phone rang unexpectedly in the sanctuary, a phone that, according to church records, had been disabled for months. The article quoted a Sister Evelyn Morgan. She said Agnes answered the silence. That's all she gave the reporter, Clara whispered. She kept digging. A second article from 1983 mentioned renewed tension among the remaining sisters. An internal memo from the diocese recommended the convent be temporarily vacated due to psychological strain and disturbing behavior exhibited during silent hours. One sister reportedly carved a series of numbers into her desk during night vigils. All of them began with 802, the same area code as the disconnected number Evelyn had circled. The deeper Clara went, the more fragmented everything became. Records redacted, names scratched out in ink, pages missing. It was like the story was trying to erase itself. She found a photo in an old diocesan newsletter, a group shot of the 1979 convent choir. Agnes in the center, Evelyn 2 rows back. Something felt wrong about the image. Not the people, but the background. Clara zoomed in. The chapel door behind them was cracked open, and just barely. Visible in the shadow was a long hand pressed against the inside of the doorframe. Too long, too thin, not human. She dropped the image. The phone in the archive room rang. She stared at it. Old, beige, no caller ID. It rang again, and again, then stopped. Her hands were shaking. She turned, packed her notebook and bolted. Outside, the streets felt wrong, off-tempo, too quiet. She walked toward her car, but someone was standing next to it. A man, mid-60s, grey beard, corduroy coat. He wasn't looking at her, just staring at the passenger seat. You look like your aunt, he said. Clara stopped cold. Did you know her? He turned and his eyes were glassy, unfocused, like someone seeing from far away. "I was the operator who received the callback." "What callback?" "In 2013, he said. Phone company still had analog monitors. At 2:17 a.m., we received a signal from a line that had been dead since 1982. But it wasn't a call, it was a pulse. A sound wave like a heartbeat, one that never ended. We traced it to the convent." "Why didn't anyone say anything?" He shook his head. "Because one of the techs who listened to the signal stopped speaking. She just started scribbling numbers on the walls. When they took her in, all she said was, 'She's still on the line.'" Clara's mouth went dry. The man stepped back. "You're not just investigating, you're answering. Don't call again, or it won't be her voice that picks up next time." He turned and walked into the fog, vanishing like a dream that ends too fast. Clara got into the car, locked the doors, and looked at the number in her notebook. Her fingers hovered above her phone screen, but she didn't press call. Not yet. The cassette tape was still in the dashboard. She played it again, and this time she heard something new at the end. A voice, different from before. "She didn't break the vow, you did." Clara didn't drive back to the city. She couldn't, not because of the fog, though it had grown unnaturally thick, but because something inside her knew this wasn't over. Not even close. She parked her car on the edge of town near the motel she used to stay in as a child with her mother. It had long since closed down, but the parking lot was still open to anyone who didn't mind the quiet. The silence felt different. Now, not peaceful, not empty. It had texture. She rolled down the window, let the night air in, and she waited. For what, she wasn't sure, but it was coming. At 2:13 a.m., her phone screen lit up. No sound, just light. The clock ticked forward. 2:14, 2:15, 2:16. She picked up the phone, opened the dial pad, stared at the number. Her finger hovered over the call button. The memory of Evelyn's voice on the tape echoed in her head. "Do not call it more than once." But she hadn't called it yet. Not even once. She hit dial. One ring, two. Then click. But no voice. Just breathing. Low, raspy, wet. She tried to speak, but her throat locked. Her tongue felt heavy. Her chest tightened, as if something inside her was bracing for impact. Then the breathing stopped, and she heard it. A whisper, faint, fragmented, but undeniably her aunt's voice. "It's not a line, it's a door." Then silence, and suddenly Clara was no longer in the car. She was still awake, still aware, but her mind had been pulled sideways. She was standing in Evelyn's room again. But it was younger, lit by candlelight, the walls intact. A soft Gregorian chant floated through the air, though there were no visible speakers, just voices echoing from nowhere. On the desk sat the phone, ringing. Clara reached for it, but this time Evelyn appeared behind her, placing a hand gently on hers. Her face was calm, but her eyes were pleading, urgent. She shook her head slowly. Clara whispered, "What is it?" But Evelyn didn't answer. She simply turned to the window and pointed. Through the warped glass, Clara could see the chapel. Hand standing at the entrance was a figure in shadow, watching. Clara turned back, and suddenly she was back in the car, gasping, covered in cold sweat. Her phone lay on the seat beside her. Call duration, 0020. Had it even connected? She looked around. The streetlights were out, but her dashboard clock still ticked. 2:27 a.m. Clara stepped out of the car. The motel lot was empty, except for one thing. At the far end, where the payphone used to stand, a small object rested on the concrete. She approached slowly. It was a tape recorder, old cassette style, the same kind Evelyn had used. There was a note taped to it. "You called, now listen." Her hands shook as she pressed play. At first, just static, then faint chanting. Latin, uneven, slowing down. Then Evelyn's voice, urgent and brittle. Agnes didn't disappear, she crossed. The sound is not sound, it's hunger. Then a pause. And something else. If the silence reaches back, don't speak. Don't answer. Just pray. Even if you don't believe, pray. Then static again. Then something else. A voice Clara didn't recognize, whispering just beneath the noise. A low, gurgling chant in a language she didn't understand. It didn't sound spoken. It sounded exhaled, like something mimicking human words but getting them wrong. Suddenly the tape stopped. The recorder ejected the cassette on its own. Clara backed away. And that's when she heard it again. Breathing. Not from the recorder. Not from the wind, from behind her. She spun around, but the lot was empty. Still, the breathing didn't stop. She realized it wasn't coming from outside her. It was coming from inside her ears. She dropped to her knees, gripping the sides of her head. The sound intensified, like dozens of mouths breathing in sync just beneath her skin. And then, a single word pierced through it all: obedience, a whisper that echoed inside her spine. Then, silence, total and immediate. The air lightened, her chest loosened, the world returned. She stumbled back to her car, shut the door, locked it 3 times and buried the recorder under a blanket. She didn't sleep, she didn't blink. When morning came, she checked her voicemail. 1 new message, no number. She pressed play, a child's voice, soft, gentle, barely audible. "Will you answer again, Clara?" She dropped the phone. "Did. You feel that too, right? I felt the presence." Clara didn't tell anyone what happened that night. Who would believe her? A phone that called itself, a voice she heard in her bones, a dream that felt more like a borrowed memory than a fantasy. But deep down, she knew what she had to do. She had to return to St. Helena's. Not as an investigator, not as a niece, but as someone who had heard the call. She arrived just before sunset, clutching Evelyn's leather notebook like a sacred object. The air was colder than it should have been. The trees didn't move in the wind, and not a single bird made a sound. She entered through the same side door, flashlight in one hand, notebook in the other. There was one room she hadn't opened, the prayer chamber, a small space behind the chapel, once used for individual confession and midnight meditation. The door was marked with a faded handprint, not painted, not stained, pressed. The handle was warm. Inside, the air was different, thinner. The walls were lined with mirrors, all covered in black cloths. In the center of the room stood a table. On it, a phone. Not a modern one, but an older rotary model just like the others she'd seen. Except this one was different. It had no cord. And yet, it was ringing. Once. Twice. Clara didn't touch it. Not yet. She flipped open Evelyn's notebook to the last few entries. "Agnes didn't break the vow, I did. I listened longer than I should have. I wanted to help. I thought prayer was strong enough. But prayer is only strong when it's not tainted by curiosity. He speaks through silence, not words, not names, just the absence of all things. And if you listen to him long enough, he makes you believe you've been alone your entire life. Agnes didn't vanish. She offered herself, not out of faith and out of guilt. She answered once, then twice. That's all it took. The phone isn't a tool, it's a doorway. Each ring is a knock. If you pick up more than once, you're not the one speaking anymore." Clara stepped back from the table. The phone stopped ringing, and the room sighed. That's the only way she could describe it. Like the walls relaxed, as if whatever had been watching her had just blinked. She turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind her. She was locked in. Panic surged, but something else rose faster. Understanding. This was what Evelyn had faced. This was what Agnes had faced. And this was what she, Clara, had to decide. She approached the phone again, sat in the wooden chair, placed both palms flat on the table. "If I answer again," she whispered, "what happens?" The phone rang. Just once. And she remembered Evelyn's final note. "Don't speak, don't answer, just pray." So Clara closed her eyes and prayed. But the voice interrupted her thoughts, inside her head, not through the phone. "Even now, You're listening. That's all it needs. She stood up, backed away. Her flashlight flickered. The mirrors shook, even under the black cloths. And then something began pressing against the glass from inside the walls. Long fingers, pale, tapping, scraping, searching. The cloths began to slip one by one. Clara ran to the far corner of the room and grabbed a crucifix from the wall. She didn't know if she believed in its power, but it was all she had. She pointed it toward the phone and said the only thing she could think of. "Evelyn, if you're still here, I'm not letting him take anyone else." The phone shattered. No sound. Just imploded. Glass, plastic, dust. Like it had been crushed by pressure from within. The lights in the room exploded in sequence, bursts of sparks and smoke. And then the room fell into darkness. And silence. Real silence. Not the presence kind, not the hungry kind, just absence. She opened the notebook once more. A new line had been written, not by her. "You heard him, but you didn't answer. That's the first key." Her breath caught, and suddenly the door unlocked with a soft click. She walked out trembling, covered in soot and dust. In the hallway, waiting for her on the floor, was a photo. Black and white. Sister Agnes. But this time, not alone. Next to her was Clara's aunt, Evelyn, holding something in her hand, a candle. Lit, and standing between them was Clara, as a child, smiling. But the photo was dated, 1977, before she was born. She dropped the photo, backed away, eyes wide. What was this? What had Evelyn known? And why had she been watching over Clara even before she existed? Her phone buzzed. One new voicemail. She played it, hands shaking. It was Evelyn's voice, faint, far, but clear. "Clara, there's one more thing you need to find. The vow wasn't mine alone. You were part of it too. If you were in their place, Katz, what would you have done?" The photo didn't make sense. Clara sat on the chapel steps, still staring at it under the pale early morning light. There she was, clearly a child no older than 5, standing between Evelyn and Sister Agnes in a photo dated nearly a decade before her birth. It wasn't doctored, she could tell. The paper was old. The ink consistent with photographs from the 70s. The handwriting on the back, unmistakably Evelyn's. "Before time bent." That was all it said. Clara tucked the photo into her notebook, but her hands were trembling now, not from fear but from recognition. The world around her was no longer linear. It wasn't just memory or mystery. It was something older, something that lived in folds of time where guilt and grace overlap. She needed answers, and there was only one place left to search: the archives under the chapel. Every convent has them. Journals, confession logs, letters never sent. Clara remembered Evelyn mentioning them once when she was a child. That's where the sisters leave things they no longer want to carry. Sometimes heaven answers, and sometimes silence does. Clara found the old trapdoor hidden beneath the altar. Warped wood, splintered around the handle. She pried it open. Dust bloomed into the air like ash. A steep staircase descended into the earth. She clicked on her flashlight, stepped down and pulled the door shut above her. Immediately the world changed. The air was thick with damp incense, old wax, forgotten prayers. It felt less like a room and more like a throat, as if she'd been swallowed by memory itself. The stone shelves were lined with boxes, handwritten labels, years dating back to the 1930s. She passed names she didn't know: Sister Magdalene, Sister Ruth, Sister Agnes. She stopped. There were 2 boxes for Agnes. The first marked 1981, the second unlabeled. She opened the first. Inside, a crucifix, worn smooth from handling, a journal, 2 photographs, both of the same stained glass window in the chapel, but in one, the image of the Virgin Mary was missing, just blank lead lines, as if the glass had refused to hold holiness. She flipped through the journal. Agnes's handwriting was strong at first, methodical, but with each entry it unraveled. There are 2 voices. One is prayer, one is permission. I said yes, without knowing what it meant. He called. I answered. I thought I could carry it. The vow was not one of silence. It was obedience, and I disobeyed by listening too long. Evelyn begged me to stop, but I had already opened the door. Clara's heart pounded. She flipped further. He doesn't need you to believe in him. He only needs you to acknowledge the silence. That's where he lives. That's his cathedral. The last entry was nearly illegible. He showed me a girl. Dark hair, dark eyes. She held the candle. She was the last. She was... It ended in a smear of ink. Clara didn't need to finish it. She was the girl. She turned to the second box. No name, no label. Only a small cassette recorder, still wrapped in a hand-stitched cloth. She unwrapped it slowly, reverently. No cassette inside, just a note folded 3 times. She recorded it before she left. We swore never to play it. If you found this, you've already broken the vow. No signature, but Clara knew Evelyn had written it. There was a cabinet across the room with labeled cassettes. She found one marked simply, Agnes 217. She inserted it into the recorder and hit play, static. Then a voice, not Agnes, not Evelyn, a child's voice. She heard the breathing too, in the walls, in the floor, even in her bones. That's where he lives now. Then silence, then Agnes. This is my final confession. Not to the church, not to the sisters, to the one I saw in the mirror. Her voice was steady, but low, hollow. I made the call, not once, twice. The first was out of fear, the second out of need. I thought I could pull him through, thought I could command silence and make it sing. But silence doesn't obey, it remembers. There was a pause, a rustle, breathing. Clara, if you're listening, I saw you in the vision before I disappeared. You were holding the candle. You were the only one who didn't speak when he asked you to. The vow passed to you before you were born. Evelyn tried to protect you. That's why she took your name out of the records, hid the photo, burned the list. But it's too late now, you've already heard him. He's waiting. He always waits. Then a long silence. Then Agnes whispered one last line. The line doesn't need a phone anymore. The tape ended. Clara sat in darkness, the flashlight flickering weakly, as if reacting to what had been heard. And now, it made sense. The line, the call, was just the echo. The ritual wasn't technological. It was spiritual. Obedience wasn't about faith, it was about thresholds, about letting something in by simply not resisting. She wasn't haunted. She was linked, tied to something Evelyn had tried to sever. But the bond went deeper. Back before she was born, before Agnes, before the convent, a generational contract buried in silence, and now the door was open again, not by mistake, by invitation. She climbed the stairs, each step heavier than the last, but something in her had shifted. No longer afraid, no longer confused. She knew what had to come next. She had to finish what they couldn't. Outside, the wind had risen. The sky was dark again. A single crow watched her from the edge of the roof. She stood under the chapel's arch and looked at the phone booth that had once stood at the corner of the property. It was gone, but the sound remained, a low hum, like breath, like silence folding in on itself. And then she heard it. Ring, not electronic, not from her phone, from inside her. Her chest vibrated, her ears buzzed. The world tilted slightly. She fell to her knees, and in that moment a voice came, not from the outside, but from deep within her memory. Evelyn, you are the last, not to receive the call, but to decide who answers next. If you were in their place, what would you have done? Clara couldn't move. She remained on her knees at the threshold of the chapel as the sound pulsed through her chest like an invisible bell. Not a ring, not truly. It was recognition. The silence was no longer absence. It was full, alive, beckoning. She clutched. The photo again. The one where she stood between Evelyn and Agnes, smiling in a time she never lived. It burned in her palm now, the edges curling slightly with heat, though there was no fire, only presence. She whispered, not knowing who was listening. Why me? The answer didn't come in words, but in weight. Suddenly, her body felt heavier, like something old had leaned on her soul. That's when she realized what Agnes meant in her final recording. The line doesn't need a phone anymore, because it was never a line between people. It was a line between worlds, between time and memory, between obedience and will, between the voice and the echo. And she, Clara, had become the echo. She stood, not by choice, but by invitation. Her legs shook. But she walked anyway, past the steps, across the dead grass toward the old garden Evelyn used to tend. Roses once bloomed here, wild and defiant. Now only thorns remained. And yet, one flower stood tall, a single blood-red bloom, untouched by decay. At its base, a book. Clara knelt and opened it, a prayer journal. Evelyn's handwriting, but not the careful, studied script of the earlier entries. This was frantic, shaky, written in candlelight with trembling hands. It doesn't want us to worship it. It wants us to replace it, to be the new echo. Each woman it marks becomes a threshold, a voice that no longer belongs to itself. Agnes resisted too late. I tried to shield Clara by pretending she was never born, but silence doesn't forget blood, and she is mine. Clara felt tears rise. She turned the page and gasped, a sketch of the chapel floor, drawn in charcoal, a sigil, a circle with 3 rings, phone lines. In the center, the words, "Obedientia in absentia," obedience in absence. She flipped the final page, a line written just once with deliberate slowness. If she returns, she must choose silence or surrender. The choice was never about survival. It was about ownership. If Clara walked away now, disconnected, the silence would find someone else. A child, a woman kneeling at a hospital bed, a man broken in a roadside chapel. It would wait. It always waited. But if she stepped in fully, she could end it. Not by defeating it, by joining it and sealing it from within. She walked back to the chapel, book in hand. Her steps steady now, her breath synchronizing with the invisible hum that followed her like a shadow. Inside, the light had changed. Candlelight danced across the floor, though there were no flames. The broken, stained glass windows glowed softly, not with sun, but with memory. She walked to the altar, set the book down. And there, where the crucifix once hung, it was the phone, whole again, resting on velvet, no cord, no dust, just waiting. She stepped forward. For the first time, no voice whispered, no breath haunted the walls. It was quiet, still. She reached for the receiver. Her fingers closed around it, and she heard Evelyn, not with her ears, but with her heart. "Don't speak. Just listen." Clara lifted the phone slowly, held it to her ear. No ringing, no breath, only her own heartbeat, and then a second heartbeat echoing, matching hers, then merging. She closed her eyes and spoke the only words she felt were hers. "I'm here, and I will carry it no further." The room shifted. The floor beneath her trembled, not violently, but as if relieved. The candlelight folded inward. The silence sighed. And then everything stopped. She opened her eyes. Morning. Real light. The chapel no longer felt dead. It felt finished. The phone was gone, the altar bare. Only the journal remained. She stepped outside. Birds sang in the distance. The sky was soft, and for the first time in years, the air smelled like lavender. The convent was still abandoned, but the presence and that terrible hum was gone, not destroyed, not exorcised, closed. Clara walked toward the gate, and there, taped gently to the old iron bar, was a photo. This time it showed only Evelyn, young, smiling, no shadow behind her, no blurred hands in the background, just peace. On the back, "You didn't break the vow, you fulfilled it." He has no more voice here. Clara wept, not from fear, but from the strange ache of release. The phone would never ring again, not for her, not for anyone. She returned to her car, placed the journal on the passenger seat, and before starting the engine, she whispered a final prayer, not to silence, not to heaven, just to memory. May every voice that was taken return. She looked in the mirror and saw her eyes clear, her mouth steady, her presence her own. If this story touched you, send it to someone who needs to hear it. Ash Hollow breathed easier now. There was no parade, no mass, no exorcism, just time, and the quiet work of memory letting go of its need to protect itself. St. Helena's convent still stood, but it had become part of the landscape, like a scar on an old tree, no longer painful, just present. Children didn't dare each other to go inside anymore. They just walked past it. It no longer needed to scare. It had already spoken. And now, it rested. Clara did not return to the city. Somewhere in her soul, something had shifted, not broken, not healed, transformed. She moved into a small white house at the edge of the woods, on the opposite side of the convent. No neighbors, no noise, just the breath of trees and the silence between leaves. Each morning she opened the windows, not to let the air in, but to let herself out. There was no ritual, no statue, no altar, no flame, but she felt the sacred in everything. In the sound of her coffee dripping, in the weight of her grandmother's rosary on her bookshelf, in the way the sunlight filtered through the curtains like dust returning home. She began gardening, slowly, reverently. She didn't grow for beauty, she grew for memory. Lavender for Evelyn, rosemary for Agnes, thyme for the voice she never answered. Some nights when the sky was heavy with stars, she would sit in the grass barefoot, feeling the dirt remember her feet. And in those moments she would hear it again, the hum. But now it wasn't fear, it was familiarity, like the distant sound of someone praying in another room, or a mother rocking a child in the next world over. Clara kept a single room, in her home untouched by decoration, no mirrors, no books, just white walls and a wooden table. And on that table sat the old tape recorder. It never played again. She didn't ask it to. It had spoken all it needed, and she had heard. Once, a week, she returned to St. Helena's, never at night, always at dawn. She never crossed the threshold again. She would kneel just outside the chapel door, close her eyes, and speak to the silence, not with words, but with stillness. And sometimes the air would shift, not violently, gently, like a page turning in a forgotten book, and she would know something had listened. One morning, as spring began to tremble under the weight of its own return, Clara found something strange. A small envelope resting on her doorstep, inside a photograph. It showed a girl, no more than 10, standing alone in a chapel lit entirely by candles. Her face was familiar, but Clara didn't know why. On the back of the photo, one sentence: "She is next. But not if you teach her the silence first. No name, no sender." She didn't panic, she simply sat with the photo, hands on her lap, and prayed, not for protection, but for clarity, because now she understood. This was never about Evelyn, never about Agnes, not even about Clara. It was about cycles, and who would be brave enough to end them by listening instead of answering. Clara wrote a letter that day, not to the girl, not to the convent, but to whoever might find her journals when she was gone. It read, "If you hear something calling you from the silence, don't run, but don't follow either. Sit, breathe, let it know you're not afraid. Because fear gives it shape, and obedience gives it voice, but presence, it gives it rest." She burned the letter with rosemary, and the smoke rose straight into the sky. No wind, no sound, just a scent. Years passed, not loudly, not quickly. Clara aged without notice. She didn't write books. She didn't give interviews, she simply lived. And with each season her garden grew wilder, fuller, as if time itself had decided to grow roots alongside her. Sometimes children from town would sneak to her property to steal herbs or glimpse the Witch of Ash Hollow, as they jokingly called her. She never stopped them. She just left extra bundles near the edge of the woods, because truth doesn't need to be defended. It only needs to be available. One evening, a woman knocked on Clara's door. Mid-30s, tired eyes, holding a baby. She didn't say much. Just, "I don't know why I'm here, but I had a dream last night. And in it, you were holding a phone. But you didn't answer. You just smiled." Clara didn't blink. She welcomed her in, made her tea. They sat in silence for 2 hours. And when the woman left, she said, "I didn't know I needed silence until I heard yours." Clara died quietly. No tragedy, no pain. One morning, her neighbors found her asleep in the garden, hand wrapped around a blooming stem of white heather. Peaceful, rooted. Next to her, a note, folded. "Tell them it didn't need to ring again. Tell them I was never alone." They buried her near the edge of St. Helena's, under a tree that hadn't bloomed in 30 years. The next spring, it blossomed with white flowers that no one could name. Botanists were baffled. Locals called it the Clara tree, but children just called it the Whisper tree, because when the wind blew through its branches, it didn't sound like wind. It sounded like a woman's voice saying, "I'm listening." The silence didn't ask her to speak. It asked her to stay. There are places where silence is not absence. It is memory, suspended in light. It is everything that was never said, waiting to be understood. You would not recognize the place where she arrived. There were no gates, no tunnel, no fire or judgment. Just stillness, a kind so total it didn't erase identity, but wrapped it like cloth around something older. Clara stood barefoot on a floor that wasn't stone, wasn't wood, just presence. Around her, no walls, no stars, but light. Everywhere, and something deeper than light. Witness. She was not alone, but she was not crowded. She was known. She reached for her voice and not her throat, and asked without lips, "Am I dead?" And the silence answered, not with a no, not with a yes, but with a knowing that death was never the threshold. The voice that formed within her was not Evelyn, not Agnes, not Clara, but all of them together, and then she saw her, Evelyn, no longer in habit, no longer old. She looked as Clara remembered her, gentle, bright-eyed, a lavender glow in her breath. She didn't speak with words. She stepped forward and offered her hands. Clara took them, and memory flooded. Not memories of her own life, but of others. She saw Agnes, not vanishing, but choosing. She saw the ritual, a vow made centuries ago by women whose names were burned out of the church's memory. They hadn't summoned anything. They had simply protected others from hearing it. It had always been there. The voice, the one beneath. Grief, the one that whispers in guilt. The one that mimics God when God is silent too long, but they didn't call it evil, because evil makes itself the center. This was shadow, unclaimed, unwitnessed, unspoken. And Evelyn had carried it for so long, not to be a martyr, but because she loved people too much to let them carry it alone. She smiled now, standing in that light. Not proud, not triumphant, just free. And beside her, Agnes appeared. Her presence was fierce and silent, like wind moving through stone. She bowed her head to Clara, not as apology, but as gratitude. Because Clara had done something none of them could. She had answered and chosen not to obey. That was the final seal. Clara asked, "Was I chosen?" And the voice that wasn't Evelyn, wasn't anyone, answered, "You were listening." And then came something unexpected. Laughter, not loud, not chaotic, but soft, sacred. Clara laughed with them, because the silence, now that it had been carried, didn't weigh anymore. It sang, not in notes, not in hymns, in truth. She was offered a choice, to remain, to return, or to become something else. A whisper in the trees, a guardian of the pause, a presence that helps others turn down the volume of guilt long enough to hear the soul beneath it. Clara didn't. Answer with words. She knelt, and the place bowed with her, somewhere far, far away. A girl woke up in the middle of the night, sweating, crying, breathing like she had been running through 1,000 years of silence. Her name was Ivy. She had never heard of Ash Hollow, but that morning she found a small pressed lavender flower tucked between the pages of her Bible, and underneath it, a note in handwriting she'd never seen. You are not alone. When it calls, don't speak. Just stay. There was no signature, but in the wind outside her window something brushed against the glass. Not a hand, not a voice, just the weight of a silence that had once been unbearable, now made sacred. Far above the chapel in Ash Hollow, in a place without clocks or doors or dust, Clara stood beside Evelyn and Agnes, and all around them were women, hundreds, some in robes, some in dresses, some in rags, some in light. None of them afraid. Each of them had held the silence at some point in time. Each had chosen presence over performance. And together, they formed a choir of the unseen, not to speak but to stay, to stand at the edge of the void, so no one else would have to fall into it alone. And when the next child, somewhere in the world, feels the weight of a phone that isn't ringing, when a woman hears breathing in her bones instead of her ears, when someone thinks they are losing their mind because grief has made the world echo too loud, they will find a candle, lit without fire, a photo of someone they never met, a name they don't recognize written in the dust, and in that moment, they will pause, and in the pause, they will find strength, not because silence is gone, but because someone stayed. Someone chose not to obey the fear, and that presence will whisper just once, "You don't have to answer. I already did." She was never the voice. She was the silence that ended it.